Hello Horror Hounds, welcome once again to my horror house. It's James Herbert time again, and we are going to be talking about his fifth novel, The Spear. Back firmly in the horror realm after the weird diversion of Fluke, but perhaps not quite as solidly horror as some fans might like. The Spear follows Harry Steadman, who's ex-British military services, and then after that formerly of Mossad, the Israeli secret service, and he sort of quit the spy business after becoming sickened with all the bloodshed. He went on a revenge rampage after his lover was killed, and is now back in Britain, sort of co-owning a detective agency, a private detective agency, with his female business partner. But he gets pulled back into the orbit of Mossad and an MI5 investigation as well into a mysterious arms dealer who's operating out of Britain, who has ties to a neo-Nazi cult. And of course, this being a James Herbert book, that cult has links to occultism, as the German Nazis in the Second World War did, and it sort of digs into that and this cult's plan ultimately to resurrect Heinrich Himmler using the spear of the title, which is the spear, the lance of Loinus, the spear that pierced the side of Christ at the crucifixion. All nice, standard horror thriller stuff. I think probably even more so now, this is pretty standard fare. The link between Nazism and some of the top echelon's fascination with the occult is now absolutely well documented, which is not to say it wasn't well documented at the time. In fact, he said, just reading off Wikipedia, he was sued for this, an earlier version of The Spear. He was sued by Trevor Ravenscroft, claiming that the novel infringed on his non-fiction work, The Spear of Destiny, and James Herbert sort of declined to pay damages and eventually removed the material from the book. I'd be fascinated to know if there are any early copies of The Spear out there that have got that material still intact. An awful lot of the chapters in this book begin with quotes either from Hitler or Himmler. I'm not a massive fan of quotes at the start of chapters, and certainly not when it happens over and over and over again in a novel. It does speak to me of a writer saying, look at all the research I've done. But he has clearly done his research, and I don't think he should necessarily be marked down for occult Nazis now being kind of a cliched thing. It was probably a little bit more fresher and more original when the novel came out in 1978. What this story is, sort of first and foremost, weirdly, in another example of Herbert trying to stretch himself with each new novel up until this point. The Spear is much more of a sort of intrigue thriller, sort of international spy thriller, than it is a horror novel. It goes obviously with the occult aspect of it, leans into horror, especially at the very, very end. But you could very easily strip out the horror aspect of it, the supernatural aspect of it completely, and you would have a really solid sort of spy thriller, the kind that typically would sell very well in airport bookshops and things like that, especially around in the 70s and 80s. And that might sound like damning with faint praise, but it's really not. Herbert's trying to plough a sort of a parallel furrow to the ones he's already tried, and he gives a go at the thriller genre, and it's really quite good. He's really quite good at it. He perhaps needn't have leant back on horror, but he is a horror writer. Horror is his thing, as he has said in interviews. Horror's been good to him, so he's never one to walk away from the genre after he's achieved his success. But I think it's the Spear is possibly testament to the fact that had he wanted to, I think he could quite easily have moved into just standard thrillers and just had an absolute other string to his bow there, and been equally successful at doing that. I'm glad he's stuck with horror. One of the things that struck me about this is how similar the sort of structure is to Ian Fleming's Moonraker, which happens to be one of my favourite Ian Fleming James Bond books, probably because it's never been adapted. I mean, the Roger Moore Moonraker bears absolutely no resemblance to Ian Fleming's Moonraker, and no real elements of that novel, as far as I'm aware, have ever sort of been adapted into movies. I'd kind of love to see a true adaptation of Moonraker. But as with that James Bond story, Harry Steadman here is asked to look into this arms dealer. He sort of makes contact with him, is invited to his sort of base of operations, is kidnapped and held captive, and there is a missile launch plan there as well, exactly as there is in Moonraker. So perhaps, I said earlier, perhaps the Nazi occult thing would have seemed a little more original back then. Maybe strangely, that would have been the original aspect of the book on release, because the thriller aspect is very tried and tested, whereas now, all these decades later, and you look back over his career, the horror stuff for him is tried and true, but his attempt at just a straightforward thriller is what stands out as the strange anomaly bit. The writing's really punchy. He's trying things here that really sort of excited me as someone who also wants to be a writer. I try and learn from every book I read. There's an excellent sort of extended sequence where he's kidnapped, tortured, and escaped, which Herbert sort of breaks up over a number of chapters, and I really like how that sort of dilates time. That has a really nice effect, because the story itself is fairly punchy. It takes place only really over a few days. It right at the start has one of the most memorable of all of James Herbert's murder sequences, death sequences. One that has stuck with me since I was a child, because it's really quite shocking in the way it sort of develops, and we as the reader learn along with Steadman what has actually happened to his business partner, which is particularly horrific. Is really well done. What surprised me on this reread, given how much of an impression that kill scene made on me when I was much younger, is how early on in the book it was, and how little time we actually spent with this lady before she's dispatched, which really threw me for a loop, because her murder had such an effect on me and resonated with me that I had sort of assumed we'd really gotten to know her as a well-rounded, sort of well-written character, but no, she's introduced, she has a few scenes, and then she's offed, and Harry is away on his sort of revenge mission. That's the impetus really for him to get back into the old business that he was trying to walk away from. Looking back, I think, especially coming straight after Fluke, I might have preferred this to have been just a pretty straightforward thriller. I wasn't particularly gripped by the horror aspects at the end, with the resurrected sort of Heinrich Himmler and his sort of psychic presence possessing people and things like that. It seemed, weirdly enough, for a James Herbert book, that the horror seemed tacked on right at the very end, and seemed a little incongruous. Maybe, I mean, I know there are hints and elements that seep into earlier parts of the book, but they're all on the fringes. I mean, there is supernatural all the way through it, but it mostly happens in the margins until we get to the very final showdown, which Herbert, if nothing else, he's really good at crafting a set piece, and we build up to an excellent set piece here with a special forces unit storming a building and a missile launch about to go off, and our heroes are inside the building as well, and there's firefights breaking out, and also the cherry on the top, the resurrected corpse of Heinrich Himmler, as you do. I found some of the talk of this sort of neo-Nazi organisation to in this day and age be a little close to the bone. I think it was something probably in 1978 that might have been more unthinkable at the time. I read part of this on a train journey and was very conscious these days that I should maybe hide, sadly, the book cover, which I think is a rollicking great book cover. There you go, the swastika's on the back as well. But someone could easily see me reading this on a train or on public transport and get absolutely the wrong idea about me, which is an absolute fucking crying shame about the state of the world today. There's a section here towards the end where Gant, the arms dealer, who's got Stedman now kidnapped, and I mean it's the typical James Bond thing of we've got you now. We can tell you our plans, but the plans ring particularly chilling in this day and age, and I just want to read you this section. Where shall we start from? Stedman can do them no harm, for he was already a dead man. They needed an outsider they could boast to, impress with the magnitude of their schemes. And Stedman listened, sometimes goading, sometimes visibly astonished at their thoroughness, at the far-reaching effects their fanatical plans would make on the governance of the country. By intricate and brilliantly devious routes, it all arrived at one simple but major conflict, right against left. It would be the only choice for the people of Britain. No in between, no fence sitting. The public would be forced to choose. Civil war would be balanced in favour of the right, for the majority would be the wealthy. Those whose sympathy lay towards nationalistic pride, and the middle classes, who had suffered so much between the elite of the country and the working classes, would choose to join them rather than be ruled by the economy-wrecking socialists. The choice would be made easy for them. New leaders would emerge, and their ideals would be uncompromising, just as Hitler's had been in the 1930s. I mean, it's sickeningly apposite in this day and age. And I think I'll just leave that there. It's an enjoyable book. It's a romp. It shows Herbert becoming a much more muscular writer. It shows him what he's done here is taken from Fluke, and this is still a focus on a main character told all the way through. No diversions, no little vignettes. I mean, that's a trick he'll come back to later, but at this stage in his career, it really seems to me that rather than bulking out a story with vignettes to have a novel-length story or to give it a widescreen scope, as with The Fog, he's really getting comfortable now with Fluke and now The Spear, with telling a novel-length story all the way through, following a main character without having to feel like he needs to sort of add little bits on here and there to flesh things out. And as I say, sort of muscular, straightforward, driving prose with a pretty exciting, if familiar, espionage type story. Of course, talking about all of the progress and the development he's making is kind of ironic, because he's going to be in his next book, Returning to the Well. It's going to be the first sequel that he writes, Lair, which will be a sequel to his first novel, The Rats. So he's going to be returning to the world of the rats next, and the next book we're going to be looking at, Lair.
I bid you welcome.
I welcome you to my house.
Welcome to my house.
Welcome to my home.